And without further ado, we will start our webinar, The Complex Challenges of Securing Smart Cities. We are fortunate enough to have two great speakers here with us, Chris Davis, who is our VP of Smart Cities, and Larry O'Brien from ARC. And I will let you guys introduce yourselves further.
Larry, please go first. You're our guest.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm Vice President of Research at ARC, and basically what that means is I do a lot of research on smart cities and cybersecurity. My background, I started the company in 1993. I actually come from the background of process control and process safety, so I did a lot of work with industrial control systems for over 20 years, including building automation systems. And then about 3 years ago, I joined the Smart Cities practice at ARC, and I've also been a member of the industrial cybersecurity team at ARC for the past 3 years.
Thank you, Larry. My name is Chris Davis. I'm VP of Smart Cities, and let's go right into the conversation. So Larry, having a similar background as you in factory floor automation and high performance buildings, can you describe sort of the evolving cybersecurity threat or threats that we're seeing in smart cities and maybe correlate how that relates to the other two industries we just talked about?
Yeah. So I don't think it's a bad thing to have a background in industrial control systems if you happen to be in smart cities right now, because a lot of the threats that we see are actually operational level threats. So they're really analogous to the industrial control system environment where you have a lot of critical processes. And these processes affect, people's health and safety. And I think the same thing applies in building automation. It applies in smart cities. The threat that we see now is increasingly an operational level threat versus an IT level threat, although there's plenty of IT level threats that are still out there. And many of those could impact operations, as we've seen with the many high profile ransomware attacks that are out there. A lot of the technology changes are having a big impact on cybersecurity right now. There's the advancement of IoT. I'll get into that a little bit more later. That's bringing with it IT-OT convergence. The two domains of operational and information technologies are kind of converging. A lot of companies have severe resource restraints. They don't have people to put on the problem. There's ubiquitous connectivity and so forth. But it's not solely a technology problem. So at ARC, we look at things in terms of these three domains of people, processes, and technology, right? Technology is no good without people to manage that technology. Ultimately, at the end of the day, people are what make things run. And the processes are just as important too. In many cases, maybe more so, how you implement that technology, how you use that technology, in the field, in the operating environment, is going to have a big impact on your cybersecurity. I think the other unique thing that we have in building automation in smart cities, well, it's not really unique. We have the same thing in the industrial sector, is this sort of combination of an aging installed base of largely proprietary technologies combined with this new technology that we see coming along. So we do see cities as critical infrastructure. The likelihood of attacks is increasing because of the many systems and interconnections that are out there, right, in smart cities. In smart cities, we're seeing a widespread use of large citywide open access networks. This increases attacker access to both IT and control systems. Growing use of sensors and IoT devices, right? There's a whole slew of new products out there. Not a lot of evaluation of the cybersecurity aspects of those products, right? And these can have a big impact. So I'll just use the example of ransomware, as one of the initial examples of the impact that cybersecurity can have. You're probably familiar with the recent attacks they had in Atlanta. That cost them more than, I think, $17 million to fix, maybe more at the end of the day. Here in Texas, where I live, we had 22 mostly rural communities that were hit, also with ransomware recently. This was a big problem for these small communities. I think it's one thing worth pointing out. Most of the headlines we read are attacks on larger cities and very high profile stuff that can really put a dent, in a city's operational budget, but they can paralyze a small town. Like we saw here in Texas with a coordinated attack that hit 22 communities all at the same time. So that's, one example of how we need kind of better funding and coordination with state level governments and so forth. But those are ransomware attacks, and while those are important, we see other types of attacks affecting us as well. Some of those attacks are going to be really from the inside, right? And they may not be malicious attacks. They may be by people who just made a mistake in configuration or something like that. It could be, intentional, right? An intentional internal attack where somebody's made some changes intentionally, to try and wreak havoc in the system. I'm not sure if you have that slide up there. We actually have survey results that we did recently. Yeah, that's the slide. So we actually went out and asked people, how would you recommend companies consider the following kinds of cyber threats? What's a major concern for you? And at the top, we have malicious attacks by disgruntled employees. But the second type of attacks is what I want to talk about, really the second and the fourth, and those are targeted attacks by unfriendly nations and targeted attacks by cyber criminals. I think ransomware probably falls into that fourth category. Targeted attacks by unfriendly nations refers to, what we would call like advanced persistent threat groups. So these are groups that really are interested in the operational level of critical infrastructure and smart cities. They mount much more complex types of attacks that occur in multiple stages. They'll typically be residing in your network for a long time before you even know that they're there. They're gathering intelligence and moving laterally across the network. And really the goal of these organizations is to kind of disrupt operations, right? The goal of these organizations has actually been to cause damage in the physical world versus doing the types of stuff that we see with ransomware attacks where it's, give me a certain amount of Bitcoin and, you get your data unencrypted, you can have your data back. Yes, those can affect the operational level, but we're seeing is much more targeted activity at the operational level within industrial control systems, even to the point where, the threat actors are reverse engineering very specific proprietary protocols within specific systems and really learning the details and the ins and outs of how these systems work. Not just how the systems work, but how they work in context with the facility that they're installed in, right? So very much kind of a deeper level of attacks that we see happening right now. I'm not sure if we have further details on the next slide here.
Yeah. Hey, Larry, one thing that came to mind listening to you is that if you look at smart cities, smart city applications and use cases are driven by data, right? Mm-hmm. And what, we describe, or the phrase I use often is, we're trying to instrument the physical world. And of course, there are a lot of physical assets that cities and utilities use. And they're outdoors, right? They can't be secured like you can inside a factory or inside a building. One classic example is if you look at a traffic controller cabinet on the corner of an intersection, they all use the same lock, and you can get that key for that lock if you just go on eBay and you can open it up, right, and attack the controllers. And if it has a network connection, kind of get in that way. So maybe you could sort of talk about the impact of cybersecurity on these IoT type devices, and how it maybe differs from the IT world, because I think
the lack of impact on IoT devices, right?
Yeah, exactly.
The lack of impact of cybersecurity. I mean, one of the analogies I always use is it was a story about a guy that it's not a smart city, but it was actually a refining complex. These guys all use the same types of systems that cities use, by the way. They're using lighting systems and building automation systems and access control systems and all this kind of stuff. So the example I'm talking about is when somebody decided it would be a good idea to go out and get some wireless IP cameras to place around an industrial site to sort of supplement the intrusion control capabilities, right? Going to Home Depot to buy wireless IP cameras to do something like this in a built-for-purpose industrial environment, right? Which I include as smart cities and smart infrastructure, building automation. This is a built-for-purpose operational environment. So you don't want to go out and buy unsecured IoT devices to use in these kinds of environments. And the problem is right now is that we're seeing a huge proliferation of these products out there. There's tons of them. The lines between what's a commercial device or a consumer device and something that is appropriate for use in an operational environment, where safety might be critical, it's getting harder to tell, what's appropriate for what. And with IoT, it's not just sensors, right? We have a whole suite of new technologies that are coming along. So people say IoT, but really IoT is a catch-all term that describes a whole variety of new technologies that we have, everything from cloud computing, to new communication methods and protocols like MQTT, containerization and virtual machines, the increasing influx of standard operating systems like Linux and Windows down to the operational level, the use of edge computing devices to do tasks that were formerly relegated to more, more purpose-built and secure type of industrial controllers, right? All the way down to the sensor is really where all this change is taking place. And it's taking place a lot faster than we've ever seen the adoption of sort of commercial off-the-shelf IT technology in the past, right? I think if you go back to the earlier days, we all witnessed the influx of Windows, as the common operating system for workstations, and so forth. But it's happening much, much faster now, almost to the point where new technology is almost being instantaneously adopted in the operational environment as soon as it comes out. So that has a huge impact on cybersecurity. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of answers for the customers in terms of which products are secure. How are they secure? What steps are you taking to make them secure?
Yeah, Larry, why is that? That's an interesting point.
So part of it is there isn't a common program for testing products to ensure that they're cyber secure, right? You can't buy a sort of imprint on a device that says cyber secure and know, okay, this device has some built from the ground up sort of designed for security features in it. There are some organizations that are actually testing and certifying devices for cybersecurity now, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about that later with standards. But there isn't a wide variety of products available with that kind of certification. The industry hasn't rallied around kind of a common standard for cybersecurity. That's another problem. And I guess maybe the biggest problem is the customers aren't asking the right questions, They may not have cybersecurity listed in their as line item criteria in their selection criteria. They may ask the question of a potential vendor, but not follow up to see how the vendor actually lives up to that promise. How do you build cybersecurity into your products? So it's really a combination of things that have to be done to make things more secure in this new IoT world.
Yeah, I know. When I attended ARC's industry forum in Orlando this February, this was a huge topic of discussion, as you may remember.
Yeah.
And what I was trying to figure out is, why is there this lack of more lack of awareness in the OT world versus the IoT world, and in the OT IoT world versus the IT world, and
yeah,
given that cities, if particularly they've got some size, they've got pretty decent, IT departments. They may have a chief information officer or CTO or something. I mean, how can the cities sort of, push this agenda to say, look, we're going to put all these sensors, these controls, these wireless networks, this and that? How can they, get some momentum going here in terms of, driving the cybersecurity agenda?
Well, it requires an agenda, right? First of all, it has to be on your radar screen as a major concern and something that you're pushing out at the highest levels of the organization, all the way down to the bottom to say that cybersecurity is something that we need to think about. That requires some sort of an overarching cybersecurity program that extends down to the OT level. I know we have IT-OT convergence as a topic of discussion, but that is a major thing that's happening in the industry right now, is these kind of traditional domains of the IT world and the operating technology world are now overlapping, right? A lot of the technology that we thought of as exclusively in the domain of IT is finding its way down into the world of operations. So that's creating a bit of a challenge, but overall the companies need to have some kind of a plan, right? Some kind of a strategy. Start somewhere to make cybersecurity a priority all the way down to the OT level. We see some cities doing that. I just read today, for example, that Singapore has actually unveiled the company's operational technology cybersecurity master plan. That was pretty interesting to read today. I wish more cities were doing that. The other thing I think it's worth pointing out is statewide coordination, right? It's not just a city issue. For people like us here in Texas, it really became a statewide issue. So when those 22 communities got attacked, they had to coordinate at the upper level, at the state level to get resources and get assistance. So you basically had the government and the other large cities, right, in Texas, trying to help out these small communities that got attacked. And I think their response plan was pretty good. That's another thing that you also need is a response plan. By the way, we can talk about that later. But really just make it a priority and start taking some steps, to drive that all the way down, even if it's something like an anti-phishing campaign, right? A lot of companies start with that because, a lot of these attacks are enabled by somebody clicking the wrong email or clicking the wrong link in an email. And then you're very quickly the victim of a phishing attack and corresponding, ransomware or malware attacks after that. So make it a priority. More cities need to make it a priority over installing all this new technology that does all this great stuff. You also have to make sure it's secure.
Yeah, Singapore is quite interesting. I lived there for 6 years, and about 3 years ago, there was a visiting delegation from Singapore that came to Boston to expressly look at smart city initiatives here and around the region. And what was very surprising to me in a very positive sense was the fact that Singapore had established a national, of course it's a small city state, cybersecurity agency. And in that delegation was the director and 3 of his key lieutenants, and then also people from Nanyang Technological University, and then from the the Singapore government. So it was a delegation of about 14
people. Yeah, they
people.
have a CSA. Yeah, and I think that's something that probably a lot of major cities might need some kind of equivalent, right? As you say, Singapore is a city state. But I can think, Houston could use a CSA, New York City could probably use a CSA. I don't know if they have an equivalent organization. The other thing we also see actually is cities starting to share information with each other and kind of pooling their resources. So we've seen other networks of cities kind of cooperating with each other on cybersecurity. We have limited resources, so you have to use those resources to their best effect sometimes, and some of these cooperation efforts are also good.
Yeah, I know that the city of New York has established a cyber command, and they've established within that cyber command an urban technology practice, which is just getting off the ground. And one of the people from that will be a future speaker for us, I think in 2020, right, Liz?
Oh.
Yeah,
I
so
look forward to
there
that.
are some of the larger cities are trying to address the problem, and what we've seen in the conversations we've had is that they're very glad to share what they learn. And I think of industry groups or companies like ARC or even companies like us can promote that conversation and collaboration. Might be pretty good.
Yep, definitely in favor of that collaboration. Also, I think that's probably one refreshing difference that you see in cities and critical infrastructure that you might not see in the industrial world, right? Because a lot of these companies don't want to talk about it on the industrial side.
Yeah. What about utilities? I mean, they're such a big player in the smart city space, and key animator, if you will. So in your practice, are you seeing much collaboration between utilities amongst themselves and then with the utilities and the cities that they serve?
Well, the utilities are kind of bound by some different specific rules, and that's NERC-CIP, right, in the US. I personally have not seen a lot of cross communication amongst utilities. When it comes to cybersecurity, maybe you've seen something different. The utilities are probably the most at risk right now because if you look at a lot of the operational level attacks that have happened over the past few years, a lot of those have been against utilities, right, and the bulk power infrastructure. So a lot of these new sort of more sophisticated multi-stage attacks like crash override and in-destroyer were aimed squarely at the power industry because of their ability to disrupt operations. And like I said before, you're taking that action in the physical world, so you're cutting off people's power and you're opening and closing breakers and so forth. This is where a lot of this type of activity has been concentrated. But I don't see a lot of sharing amongst the utility people.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm
So if we can
wrong.
kind of, Larry, circle back to smart cities, I think probably some of the larger cities have started, cybersecurity practices like New York. I know Boston's engaged, but many of the cities that want to become smart are what I would call small to medium-sized cities. So,
Right.
what kind of standards, what type of industry groups should they start to follow, to build awareness and to build capability? And then sort of a follow-on question, how do cities get started and really develop a good cybersecurity program?
Okay, so let's touch on the topic of standards. There's a lot of them out there. I think they always say standards are great, everybody should have one, right? But there are several standards that are very relevant to smart cities and critical infrastructure. And as I said before, the industry segment as a whole does not seem to have rallied around a particular standard, right? They haven't embraced a single standard, particularly at the operational level. So the ones that I look at that I think are more pertinent, some of these are standards per se, and some are not quite standards. So we have ISA 62443. Which is also the IEC, the International Electrotechnical Commission standard for cybersecurity in industrial and operational environments. So that is both an ANSI standard and an IEC international standard. We are very bullish on this standard. It covers many areas that are very pertinent to building automation in smart cities. You have the NIST framework, which is not, it's not a standard per se, but it's a risk-based framework that you can use to implement a better cybersecurity strategy within your organization. We have ISO 27000, which is more of an IT level standard, but a lot of organizations use ISO 27000 as kind of a springboard to developing better operational level cybersecurity. There's obviously some commonalities there. And I mentioned NERC CIP, National Electric Reliability Council standard for the power industry, which all the power companies have to follow. I also think it's worth mentioning DHS, and this is where we start getting into kind of acronym soup with all the government-sponsored organizations. But DHS, under the umbrella of DHS, you have a lot of organizations that can provide you with resources. There's the NCIC, NCCIC, which is, I think that's what they're using now to describe the old CERT organization. There's the ICSJWG, which is the Industrial Control System Joint Working Group meeting that I think you've been to, right? I've been to it several times. A lot of good cybersecurity experts there, very concentrated on the OT world. Not just for industrial, but also for smart cities, smart infrastructure. So there's a lot of resources out there. UL has a standard. They have the 2900 series of standards. I would start, if you're a small town, small community, or medium-sized city, with not really an idea where should I start, what should I do, DHS does have resources that they can help you with. They actually have pretty smart people that will actually come out and assist you. I know a lot of these people. They are actually smart people. They will help you. IEC 62443, ISA 62443 is definitely a standard that's worth checking out. They offer ISA secure certification. So if you remember what I said before about getting products that are certified, they've been through some kind of a certification process and have a stamp on them that says this has been tested for security, and explaining how ISA secure certification does that. ISA, I believe, has an alliance with CABA, the Continental Automated Buildings Association, to do testing, cybersecurity testing and certification for products in the building automation sector. So they are actually doing stuff that's specific to building automation. So they are definitely worth checking out. You know, my advice.
Are there any
Sorry, go
European
ahead.
standards that should be looked at? Or I know if you talk about ISA and IEEE, I mean those are obviously international groups, but are there any standards or practices that are EU specific that
Oh, that's
have relevance in
62443.
this space?
I mean, 62443 is IEC, which encompasses the EU.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an international standard.
Okay.
Yeah.
We got just a couple minutes here, so let's kind of get to the last question or two, and then we'll go to submitted questions. There are a lot of products that are kind of going into this smart city portfolio. So, Larry, if you could talk a little bit about good cybersecurity, both vendor and product selection. What are kind of some of the do's and the don'ts, best practices? Do this, don't do that. My gosh, don't do that ever.
So yeah, vendor selection. I mean, as I mentioned before, not a lot of end users are incorporating cybersecurity into, say, their building automation system selection criteria, right? There's a couple of ways you can look at this. You can look at it in terms of selecting products that aren't what you would normally consider to be quote unquote cybersecurity products, right? So you want to look at building automation systems, or if I'm looking at my lighting control system, right, for example, or any kind of system like that, you really have to add cybersecurity related selection criteria there and ask your vendors, how are you addressing cybersecurity? Please explain. And we've done some of that for things like building automation systems and so forth. I actually used to do, I still do supplier selection projects. And this just a couple of years ago, I was doing one over on the industrial side, and we had realized that, we're doing this system selection process. We don't have any cybersecurity related selection criteria. We need to start adding these now, and this was a pretty large company. You'd be surprised if I told you the name of the company, but this is something that is not just affecting small organizations. This is even the really big internationally known companies struggle with this as well. So work cybersecurity related selection criteria into your process. And the other thing I would recommend would be to familiarize yourself with the market for cybersecurity products and applications and services, right? So that's a whole other marketplace that's sprung up around us in the past decade or so. There's hundreds of these companies that are out there. A lot of them are still in the startup stages. So it can be difficult to navigate what the product offerings are. Are the companies going to be stable, 5-10 years from now? Are they going to get acquired? So that part of it is a whole other issue. What types of cybersecurity products might I need? And how do I go about selecting those suppliers, and what's the supplier landscape?
Yeah. Larry, if we go back to the second question, where a lot of for instrumenting the outside physical world of cities, a lot of these devices are outdoors. Let's assume that they can be physically secured. Most of them, speak over wireless networks. So is there anything that the smart grid network providers on which many of these devices communicate, is there anything they can do at the network wireless level or in their access point or grid router level to provide a layer of protection if for some reason or another a specific device, let's say it's a pressure sensor on a fire hydrant, is hacked? Are there any defenses that are built in sort of the value chain going up to cloud-based applications?
There can be those types of defenses built in this age of IoT. We're finding that zero trust cybersecurity schemes are being talked about a lot. That's basically an environment where nothing trusts anything else, right? The hardware doesn't trust the software and vice versa. This is very popular with edge implementations. End-to-end secure encrypted network designs are necessary. So there's zero trust, but there's also a whole other range of products out there that could do similar things. We have things like data diodes, which ensure one-way data communication. So even if you physically cannot get into the device remotely to do anything to it, that's what a data diode is. We have next generation firewall. So that's actually where you start getting into that discussion of what what types of capabilities do I want to implement in these products? And then you have things like threat detection and response solutions, which are solutions that will go out and automatically take inventory of your assets that are on the network, and then monitor them for sort of anomalous, or potentially threatening behavior. And some of these capabilities are being worked into other types of products as well, right? So with a lot of this virtualization and containerization, we're starting to see things like virtual firewalls and things like that can be embedded into other products. So a lot of that is really changing too.
Okay. In the slide deck, there is a slide with suggested resources. And just before we open it up for questions from the listeners, I'd just like to ask you, if you were standing in front of, let's say, a medium-sized city mayor, and in his office with, let's say, his city manager, what would you say to him with respect to cybersecurity? What would be your most important advice and counsel you could impart to them?
Well, start a plan if you don't have one. This isn't something that you need to dump tons of money into right away. You can start simple. You have to start from the top down. Any kind of an initiative like this has to be driven from the top down in order to be successful. Have a response plan would be another thing. Okay, if you read a lot about these recent ransomware attacks, for example, a lot of these cities and communities didn't have a response plan. They didn't know what they were going to do if they got attacked by a ransomware attack. They didn't know if their policy was going to be to pay the ransom or not pay the ransom, or what have you, right? So actually having a simple response plan and some simple policies in place could actually save you a lot of headaches if you are attacked. And start implementing some of the technology. You can start basic. We actually have a maturity model. I don't know if it made it into the deck here, if we already went over it. I've kind of been bouncing back and forth between a bunch of different things, but having a response plan and having some kind of a maturity model that you can follow so you know how far along you are in your implementation of cybersecurity helps. We have one, but NIST also has a good one. They have a good risk model that you can use. A lot of companies are looking at risk now, risk-based approaches, because they do have to, they see the value proposition of all this new technology, but they want to be able to somehow balance the risk, the cyber risk of, this technology versus the business value. So I would also suggest looking at that as well.
All right. We'll open it up to questions from the listeners. We just barely scratched the surface, and I know when we've met before, we could probably spend.
Yeah, we could keep talking.
And a case of wine or two, just discussing this topic, because it's quite broad, and hopefully we can build some momentum behind awareness in this WebEx. So Liz, any questions from the audience?
We have a few
questions.
Thank you, Larry. Okay, first question. What are the top 3 things to do to ensure that smart city sensors that we want to deploy won't expose us to an attack? So if you could prioritize 3 things that you could do to make sure that these extra devices you're deploying out in your city remain secure, what would those be?
Well, ensure one-way communication might be a good way to do it. Evaluate the vendor and the product. That's the number one thing you can do. Do the evaluation. Know what the capabilities of the product are. How are they relying on providing a story around cybersecurity? This is one of the things I did actually it's one of the things I do when I go to these trade shows that are smart city oriented, and I go to the vendor booths and I ask them, well, how do you handle cybersecurity? With sensors, it's not a proprietary chunk of bandwidth isn't going to make you secure, right? Buying a product isn't going to make you secure. You have to intelligently evaluate the product, and then you have to come up with any kind of supplemental measures that might need to be taken if the product doesn't provide enough, security designed into the product. And then you're going to have to determine what those measures are going to be, and there's various, ways you can do that at the sensor level. But really at the sensor level, there is not a lot of, if there's not a lot of attention being paid to this issue at the control system level, there's even less attention being paid at the sensor level. So really do your homework, evaluate the products. Don't buy products that aren't made for deployment in these types of critical environments, where safety is crucial. And just, do your homework. Probably
Great,
the best
thank
piece
you.
of advice I can offer.
Okay, our next question is about personnel training. Do you have any recommendations on how to train teams that are deploying these systems or using these systems, or even more broadly in the organization? How do we educate the
Yeah, so
our
forming
personnel?
cross-functional teams is a good way to do that. I talked about IT/OT convergence before. The people on the IT side need to talk to the people on the OT side. People need to share information. For training, you're going to have to invest in training. There's a lot of good resources for training out there, fortunately. There's SANS Institute, which probably does the bulk of cybersecurity training in the US and also other parts of the world. They offer testing for specific OT level cybersecurity certifications that you can get. There is organizations like ISA also offer training. A lot of the vendors are starting to offer training now as well. So you can go to your vendor and ask them what kind of training options they have. That would be my advice, is go to some of those resources for training. DHS also offers training too. I've been to some of their training sessions at ICSJWG. They have very knowledgeable people doing training there. And that's at a minimal cost also. So lots of good training resources out there. Don't be afraid to make the investment in training. I think a lot of times justifying, investment in training and even investment in cybersecurity is kind of difficult because you're trying to justify, oh, so this is something bad that will not happen if we invest in this, right? It doesn't have that quote unquote direct impact, on the bottom line, but it does if you're attacked. Definitely does if you're attacked. So.
Yeah, one other thought, Larry. I get meetup emails, and there is a fairly active cybersecurity meetup group in the Boston area that tackles a lot of these additional topics, and they have meetings more frequently over the fall and winter and spring. But it's another set of resources and a good way to network and kind of learn what you need to learn, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, SANS has a pretty good message board too. It's an ICS forum. It's all stuff that's control system related. That includes building automation at smart cities also. Another good resource.
All right, we have one more question. Can you please, Larry, clarify some of the differences between these cybersecurity standards? Why are some more valuable than others, or how are they fundamentally different?
Well, to me, 62443 is fundamentally different because it is very specific to operational environments and the world of ICS and OT. That is the only quote unquote major standards effort that is really very mature and has been around for a long time. That addresses that space. That's what's unique about that. A 27,000 is more broad-based. It's more across different companies, different industries, more at the IT level. So that the focus is a little bit different there. And then you have groups, like I said before, they're not really standards, right? But they are, maybe they're de facto standards or quasi standards type groups. Where you can still get a lot of good information and a lot of good input as far as establishing your own cybersecurity strategy. And that's where you start getting into like the NIST framework and things like that, deploying the NIST framework.
Great.
So everybody's got kind of a different focus. Each one of these groups has a little bit of a different focus.
Thank you very much. With that, we will wrap up this conversation, although to Chris and Larry's point, we're only scratching the surface. So audience, remember, we will be sending out this slide deck and the recording following the webinar. And we hope to see you at some of our future webinars coming up. We have a conversation on the city of Erie and how they've used SimCon and Quantella to transform their city through smart city applications and innovation. Our next webinar following is a conversation about open data projects for cities and how we can deliver services to improve efficiencies with open data platforms. So both really exciting conversations coming up. We hope you all can join us. Chris and Larry, thank you for your time. We're excited to have you guys, and we hope to see you all again.